Now, whenever I'm writing music for a film or a TV show or a song or whatever it might be, I think very, very carefully about my harmony. It's almost the thing I spend the most time on. In my opinion, harmony is where the real magic happens, where the real crux of the emotion takes place. Now, you might argue with me on that, but in my opinion, a great melody with poor harmony doesn't give you goosebumps. A great harmony with a reasonably bland melody can make a person cry. So harmony is really powerful, and you need to learn a few tricks in order to harness that power. Okay, so let's have a really good think about what chords you might want to use in your orchestral piece. But where do we even start with all this? Well, there's no secret here, folks. It's the same old chestnut we talked about when writing your cell. The secret is start simple. Okay, we can always add complexity as we go, but the secret to writing a great harmony is to start really simple, leaving room for it to grow and expand. If you start with a harmony that is already complex right at the start, you're bound to end up in a big mess. It's kind of like writing a story. You'd never start your first page with a complex web of plot lines and characters. Your reader will be instantly lost and throw your book to the bottom of the pile. You're more likely to introduce the main character and spend some time acquainting your reader with an easy-to-follow storyline, and then gradually introducing characters and complexity as you go. Now, it's the exact same thing with your harmonies. So ideally, you really only need to start with 3, 4, or 5 simple chords that fit your cell. And you can always add more later and add more complexity to those basic chords that you've come up with. But how do you know that the chords are going to fit your cell? Okay, let's back up a bit here and do a bit of a crash course in how harmony actually works before we launch into writing some chords without really understanding what they're doing. Harmony is a huge topic and one that can get very complicated, but there's a real simplicity to the function of harmony. And once you know this, it's rather simple, and you can start unlocking the enormous musical and emotional power of your chord choices. So in a nutshell, all harmony should really be a balance of tension and release, feeling like we're away from home and then feeling like we've returned home over and over and over throughout your piece. Writing music for the Aussie soap drama Home and Away may have rubbed off on me, but that doesn't diminish the importance of this concept when writing your harmony. In fact, there's a good reason we call harmony harmony. It's always about finding a balance between these notes that feel tense and notes that feel calm. But your biggest job in writing a killer chord progression is working out exactly where you want that tension and where you want that release. And once you've figured that out and harnessed that power, then, amazing things can happen. But how long do you want to hold someone in a state of tension? Just a few bars or an entire sequence? These decisions should always relate back to your original idea. In fact, I always let my original idea guide my harmonic choices about where I want tension and where I want to feel away from home, and then where I want my release or where I feel like I've returned home. So, for example, if my original topic was to write a sad piece of music, I would really think hard about how I could use my harmony to evoke this. If you worked hard during your brainstorming session a few chapters ago, you might already have some fantastic ideas, at least, loose or broad ideas about what you might do with your harmony, and that's a fantastic start, and we can certainly expand on that. Now, if it was a sad piece that we've chosen to write, perhaps there will be prolonged episodes of tension in my harmony, a feeling of being in constant anguish. And then these might be followed by only momentary snippets of relief. So I'm using my original idea to form some opinions about what I might do with this balancing of tension and release in my harmony. Okay, so the best way of thinking about this feeling of being away from home and returning to home, the broadest and the best possible way to start understanding this is to think about chord 1 and chord 5. Chord 1 being the home chord, we also call this the tonic chord, and chord 5 being the chord that is furthest away from home. So if we were in C major, for example, just as a quick example, chord 1, or the tonic chord, is C major. Okay, so we're in C major, so our tonic chord is based on C at the bottom, and then we just construct a major chord from there, like this. Okay, so that is the chord that is going to feel the most like home. Okay, now the chord that feels the furthest away from home is actually the chord that sits right in the middle of this scale. And that would be, in this case, chord 5, or G. The reason we call it chord 5 is simply because it is 5 steps away from our starting point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We call this the dominant chord. So tonic chord, or chord 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we construct a chord on that 5th, and we call that the dominant chord. So this is away, this is home. Home, away, return back home. Okay, so we've got some musical expectations around how the ebb and flow between chord 1 and chord 5 make us feel emotionally. So in context, if I were to do something based on C, and then G, oh, okay, we definitely feel like we returned home there on that last chord, which is a C chord. Okay, so we started on a home chord, we went off to chord 5, we went on a bit of a journey to a few other chords, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next coming lessons, and then had a bit of a journey, felt like we were away from home, a little bit of tension, and then finally we came back to what felt like home and we could kind of relax. So musicologists and music theorists have argued that all music, no matter what its genre or its style, can essentially be broken down at the core level to basically something that moves from home, or chord 1, to something that moves away from home, chord 5, with maybe some complexity thrown in there. And of course, we'll talk about how to add complexity later on in the next coming lessons, and then returning back home. So this is a concept I want you to get familiar with as we work through the next couple of lessons. So let's have a look at how John Williams has used this in a score excerpt from Schindler's List. Okay, so he uses a chord progression that avoids getting back to that tonic chord or that home chord. And this gives us the feeling that this grief is never ending, that the pain goes on. And for any of you who have actually seen Schindler's List, it's a extremely moving film about the Holocaust, and Schindler's List's score, which was written by John Williams, is an incredible masterpiece of writing music that just feels like an endless heartache. But he has used some musical tricks that help achieve this, and one of these tricks is to simply avoid getting back to anything that feels comfortable or anything that feels like home. And this sort of helps the audience and the listener feel like they're constantly in anguish. They can never really feel relaxed. Okay, now he does this by using something called a deceptive cadence, or it's also known as an interrupted cadence. Now, let's just back up a little bit here. So first of all, let's define what a cadence actually is. I want you to think of a cadence as kind of like a full stop at the end of a musical sentence. All music, whether it's an orchestral piece or a song, is made up of lots and lots and lots of musical sentences, all strung together to form a whole piece of music. We also sometimes call these musical sentences musical phrases. So you can use either word and that's fine. Now, as I said, music is just made up of many phrases or musical sentences strung together. Okay, so for example, this could be a musical phrase. Okay, so it's like a complete musical sentence. It can then move on and state another phrase. Okay, so phrase 1 at the beginning and then phrase 2, and it can go on and on and on like this. And basically music is just made up of a lot of these phrases, one after the other. But within each of those phrases, we make use of a lot of what we call cadences. So each of those phrases has a full stop at the end of that particular sentence, and we call that a final cadence, okay? So our entire musical sentence, which can often be 4, 8, or 16 bars long, has been aiming for this full stop. All the musical ideas in that phrase have been geared towards reaching that final cadence or that final full stop. At the full stop, we generally return to something that feels like home. So everything has been sort of working up to building tension, and then finally that release on that final cadence or that final full stop when we come to rest at the end of that musical sentence. And usually that is the tonic chord. So if you're in C, you'll usually return back to C. Okay, so an entire musical sentence or phrase, as I said, it's often a 4, 8, or 16 bar phrase, and everything is leading to come back to that final tonic chord where we feel like we're home. So let me give you another example, something like this maybe. All right, so that's the final cadence, that full stop. We've come back home. Okay? However, we can also break up phrases or musical sentences with commas as well, or other small cadences. We don't immediately always have to come back to that final cadence that feels like home. We can add commas that take us on an unexpected journey throughout the phrase. And at those moments, we generally avoid going back to that tonic chord or the home chord. Instead, we choose another chord, and we often use a deceptive or interrupted cadence, which lands on a chord that's built from the 6th note of the scale. So if we were in C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we would build a chord on that note instead. So as we already know, this is chord 1. This is chord 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is chord 6. Now, if we go to that 6th chord and treat it like a comma in the middle of a musical sentence, it can often be unexpected. So let me give you a little example. Okay, it feels like there's a comma there. We haven't finished, it's hanging, there's tension there, it doesn't feel complete. We need that musical phrase to keep going in order for us to feel like we're going to return home. So say we've landed here, but then we might complete this musical phrase with something like that, and eventually we do land back on home. But there was that comma in the middle. Okay, so that's something that John Williams is making use of here. He's taking us on an unexpected journey where we feel like we should possibly return home. We don't. We go on an unexpected departure into that chord 6, creating what is called a deceptive or an interrupted cadence. Okay, so in the score example I've shown you here, John Williams uses 2 deceptive cadences which are marked in. Now at these moments, we could have chosen to resolve to the tonic chord, completing that phrase by returning to home, but he doesn't. He extends the phrase by going somewhere that doesn't feel like home. And then he repeats this again, setting us up to think that we're returning home, only to suddenly take us away from this expected return home. He's avoiding getting back to that home chord or the tonic chord because he wants the audience to feel like they're trapped in this endless feeling of sadness. We never get that sense of relief or feeling like our sadness has ended. It's this constant journey of feeling sad continuously. Okay, so that's a cool little trick that you can use, particularly if you're writing emotive or sad-inspired music. Okay, let me play this for you to demonstrate how this sounds. The expectation of coming home isn't met. We go somewhere else instead, and that then creates this sort of perpetual feeling of being trapped in this endless sadness. Okay, so it starts off like this. And we expect here that we could go home, right? Feels like we could land there, but in fact, he doesn't do that. He goes here instead. He takes us somewhere else. And again, here we feel like we could go home, but he doesn't. Let me play that. Gone home yet. And then finally, eventually, we get home. But it takes a long time before we finally reach that tonic chord at the end. He's also using something called suspensions, which you may have picked up on. And this is where we play a normal major or minor chord. So let me demonstrate in C major, just because that's easy. So here's a normal C major chord, but if we add a suspended fourth to it, what we do is we actually substitute that third note, 1, 2, 3. We get rid of that and we add a fourth note instead. Okay, that's called a suspended fourth. It creates this feeling of being somewhat suspended. It creates a momentary tension that is either then resolved or possibly not resolved. Okay, so there's that moment of tension, release. We can also create a suspended second. So again, we get rid of that third note and we replace it with a 2, 1, 2. Which again can be resolved, otherwise we can leave it. If we leave it, okay, so so finally you can come back to rest, but those suspensions can be quite powerful, and you can see that John Williams has used them here in this example from Schindler's List, even just that second chord here. Okay, so this chord here, if we rearrange that and we take that top note and we put it down here, it's actually just creating a 1, 2, 3, 4, a suspended 4, and then that fourth resolves down to the major third. It could also resolve to the minor third too, if you wanted it to. He could have done a suspended second there as well. Let's see what that would have sounded like. Okay, here's the 4, but we could have had a second there instead. A suspended second is a little more positive sounding because it resolves upwards. So if we go back to our C major example, suspended second resolves upwards, and a suspended 4 falls downwards to that third. So anything that rises is always going to sound a little more hopeful and a little more positive than things that fall. Now that's a general rule as well for the overall shape of your chord progression. If it's moving upwards, it's going to feel a lot more positive than a chord progression that is generally moving downwards. So even if we were in C major, if our progression is moving downwards, it's going to have a sadder feel to it. Okay, so mostly major chords, but it felt like it was a little sadder because the whole progression was moving downwards. If we had a progression moving upwards, it's going to sound more positive. Okay, even though there were some minor chords in that progression, the general overall shape definitely has an impact on the emotion. Also, you don't need lots and lots of chords strung together in a row to create an interesting harmony. Just because I did all this, fancy stuff, it doesn't mean that you need to do that. In fact, you can have a pretty amazing and powerful harmony just by having one chord. Just a C chord, or let's choose something new. Let's try a D chord. Now it's how you play that chord and the color that you give to that one chord that can make all the difference. You don't have to just play a D chord like this. There's so many ways you could play it. What about playing it with some rhythm? Adding in some octaves. Or even changing the register. Or instead of playing it as a block chord with all the notes coming at once, you could play it as an arpeggiated chord, separating the notes. And all I'm doing in the left hand is simply playing the exact same notes, but just in octaves. I could play that together like this as arpeggiated chords, and they're moving in what we call similar motion because they're both starting on the D, moving up together and then down together. Similar motion, they're going in the same direction. You can also play anything in contrary motion, so essentially going in opposite directions. Now what happens if I start adding in some articulations to this? Some short staccato notes? Or what about and some dynamics? I can play it really quiet or really loud. What if I were to even play those, the right hands in octaves this time? We haven't even talked about adding suspensions to all of the above. I mean, you could do the same thing, but adding in that suspended fourth or suspended second as well. Or a combination. Maybe one hand could do one and the other could do the other. and seconds in my kind of right hand part there. So I didn't even change chord. It was all the same chord, and yet I got so much mileage out of playing that chord in a few different ways. One other thing you can have a bit of a play around with is something called paradiddles, and that comes from drumming. Essentially with paradiddles, it's a different combination of left, right patterns with each hand. So you've got, obviously, you can play things together, right, left. So it's just a combination of right, left, right, left, left. So sometimes I just literally get a piece of paper, write L, L, R, R, T for together, R, R, L, R, R, and just a random assortment of left, rights, and togethers. And then I use that to come up with a cool little paradiddle.